Welcome tonight to the update on the Ukraine war. This is Jim Dingeman. I wanted to first introduce the latest commentary by Colonel Markus Reisner of the Austrian Military Academy. He's been pretty powerful in his commentary about this conflict, and this is what Colonel Reisner had to say about the latest developments in the war in Ukraine.
Welcome to the Austrian Military Academy in Wiener Neustadt. I'm Colonel Markus Reisner, and today I would like to give you a new brief on the situation in Donbass, what is going on when it comes to the battle for Donbass. So day 135, 8th of June 22. So let us first start with a short orientation. As we have seen in the last 3 months, the main focus of the battle in Donbass was, of course, directly in Donbass area. We also had some skirmishes at Kharkiv, Kherson, and also somewhere along the front line in the south, but the main effort of both sides was, of course, the battle in Donbass. Let us now have a look at these 3 months in detail. First of all, after the Russians have transferred the troops from Kiev area direction east, they started in the beginning of April with the so-called shaping phase. Shaping phase means that they tried to change their tactics. So they were changing their tactics from attacking small and very fast to first artillery support and then a very slow advance. When we compare the maps from the 3rd of April till the end of the battle for Donbass, when it comes to the cauldron east of Sloviansk and Kramatorsk, then we can see the amount of terrain which was occupied by the Russian troops in the last 3 months. So let us have a look in detail what was happening during the last, especially 2 months. First of all, we have to remind us again that there was the breakthrough at Popasnaya on the 5th and 6th of May in the east of the cauldron. So from this area, the Russians were able to penetrate into the Ukrainian defense lines to the north, south, and to the west. So what happened next is that the Russians formed a cauldron the size of 40 to 40 kilometers. It looks like that the Russians were reluctant to close the cauldron because they wanted the Ukrainians to bring in more forces and especially Western weapon systems, which then were destroyed by the Russians in the cauldron. When we compare the situation from May the 24th to the May the 29th, then we can see that the Russian troops were advancing more and more into the center of the cauldron, closing the 2 main lines of communications which were leading into the cauldron. The next thing which happened was that the Russians formed 2 smaller cauldrons, one in this area at Soloti and northeast of it. So that means after the occupation of Severodonetsk, they also managed to occupy these small areas and attack further direction Lysychansk. On the 1st of July, the whole situation became dynamic. Why was this the case? Because the Russians conducted a bridging operation over the Seversky Donetsk in the north of the cauldron, and together from the north and from the east attacked the Ukrainian troops, which started to retreat. The retreat was partly done in chaos, as we can see in the next video, where you can see that the Ukrainian soldiers pretty much were simply running out of the cauldron direction west. The result was that both cities, Severodonetsk and Lysychansk, were captured by the Russian troops. You can see on this video from the center of Lysychansk the Russian troops, Chechen troops, and also troops from the separatist units. You can also see the 3 flags, the flag of Russia, the flag of Luhansk, and of course the flag related to the Great Patriotic War, because this is the flag from the unit which captured the Reichstag in Berlin. So that means on the 3rd of July, after 3 months of battle, this 40 by 40 kilometers cauldron was closed. The question is now, what can we expect in the next days, weeks, and months to come? Again, I would like to stress my assessment by using the following factors: terrain, time, information, and force. And I would also like to stress that this is a huge area from Dnepro, Petrovsk, till the Donbass area. So that means the cauldron, which was closed in the last days, was only 40 to 40 kilometers, while the city Kramatorsk and Slavyansk in the depths of the Donbass is in a distance of about 60 to 70 kilometers. And as you can see, there's a long front line going via Donetsk up to Zaporozhye in the south. So let us start first with terrain. The question is, what is the best defensible line for the Ukrainian side? It looks like that there is a good line from Siversk down to Bakhmut. It could be that the Ukrainians already start to defend from this line against the further Russian attacks. It could also be that the Ukrainians retreat further till the line of Slovyansk, Kramatorsk, till Tordesk. Why is this line quite defensible? Because it's a string of pearls of different cities which are in one row from the north leading down to the south. What we don't know is how many troops were able from the Ukrainian side to retreat in good order to the west and be able there to defend against further Russian attacks. So the next question would be the time. Will there be some kind of an operational pause or not? This picture is quite interesting because it shows a visit of Sergei Shoigu in Donbass on the 24th and 25th of June. You can see the on-scene commander, Gennady Shitko, who is responsible for running the operation there. And we also know that Alexander Lapin and Sergei Surovikin are the two generals who are responsible for the fight in Donbass and in the south. If it looks like that the Russians will have their momentum to fight and attack further direction west, then very likely they will do so. But if the resistance of the Ukrainian is getting strong again, then there might be some kind of operational pause for regrouping and then a further attack in the next days and weeks to come. The next interesting thing is information. Where will the Russians attack? At the moment, it looks like that there are possibilities, especially from the north, because we know that the Russians try to group some elements in the north of the Donbass, and there might be some kind of spearheading attack down to the south to outflank the Ukrainian defense lines in the east of it. That could be, but we don't know. But it's very likely that the Russians again will try such a maneuver, which is very common for their tactics. The next question, which is important, is force, the force ratio. We know that from the beginning, the Russians were reinforcing their elements. We know that at the beginning of the battle for Donbass, the ratio was about 81 battalion size elements of the Ukrainian side versus 93 battalion size elements on the Russian side, the so-called battalion tactical groups. As it looks like, in the last weeks, the Russians reinforced these 93 battalion tactical groups by another 15, so that's about 108. While on the other side, we know that the Ukrainian troops were treated in a way that it's said, experts mean that there are about 60 of them available, 16 battalion size elements. So if you look at the force ratio, then you can see that the possibility of the Ukrainians to fight is degrading, while the Russian side is still increasing the size of troops by bringing in troops and heavy material from Russia. It's said that in a week, 1 or 2 military trains full of equipment and soldiers are coming into the Donbass area especially. Let us have a look at the game changers. So we know that the heavy weapons were delivered. We know that the amounts were not very big, but it looks like that certain systems have an impact. Of course, there were about 250 heavy tanks delivered, mainly from the type of T-72. We know that they are used also in Kharkiv, but also in Kherson area, and we know some of them are captured and even destroyed, but we don't know exactly what kind of effect they will finally have on the battlefield. The same with the artillery systems. We know that the German Panzerhaubitze 2000 or the Polish Grab system are working on the Russian troops, and we also know that the HIMARS started to work. At the moment, we know that about 2 elements, 2 launches each, are deployed in the area. We also know that certain types of weapons are used, like the Smart 155, which is used by the Panzerhaubitze 2000 and give the possibility to have very precise hit on a possible target. Let us have a short look at the HIMARS system. The HIMARS system is interesting because it looks like that the HIMARS system was already used against Russian ammo depots on Ukrainian and even Russian soil. So these pictures show the remains of one of these rockets which are used. It's a certain type of rocket. It's the M31A1 GMLRS. This type of rocket is able to fly about 80 kilometers. And there was a quite significant attack on the ammo depot at Melitopol, which is exactly in a distance of 80 kilometers to the next Ukrainian front lines. And we would like to show you a video where you can see the detonation of this ammunition depot. What we always have to keep in mind that we still have a war of attrition, and this war of attrition is done on two levels. The first level is the tactical operational level. It's interesting that just recently a high-ranking Ukrainian general said that their losses are quite high. I have from this article some citation for you. So first of all, he said we have about 50% of our equipment and even soldiers lost. That means about 1,300 infantry fighting vehicles, over 400 tanks, over 700 artillery systems. He even said that the M777, that was an howitzer which was delivered by the Americans in an amount of about 120 pieces, in addition to the Australians and other nations, that they are only able to fire 1 or 2 shots, and then there will be counterfire from the Russians, which then results in a damage of these artillery pieces, which then have to be brought back to the rear to be repaired. When he says about bringing back to the rear, that even means to Poland to be repaired there and brought back into the battle in Ukraine. The next level, which is important, is the strategic level. Because still, since the 24th of February, we are seeing attacks in Ukraine on a daily basis, day and night, especially by the Air Force, but also by ballistic missiles. The president itself said that on the 9th of June, until now, 2,600 missiles were used against Ukraine. At the moment, the number is already higher, close to 2,800. But the problem is, as long as Ukraine has no air defense and no air force, it cannot defend itself against this strategic attrition. And one example for this air attacks is the night of the 25th to the 26th of June, where a huge amount of Russian aircraft entered the airspace of Belarus and from there sent missiles and rockets into the airspace of Ukraine, where they were hitting certain targets. Let us just make a look at the 4 core problems of Ukraine. So the 4 core problems are still unchanged. First of all, Ukraine managed to hold the center of gravity, the political and military center in Kiev, and they were also able to withstand any attack from the Belarusian side in the west of the country. Still unsolved is the problem in Donbass, you know, the place where the battle was taking part in the last 3 months, and maybe also very likely in the upcoming months. And the 4th problem, which is still unsolved, is the problem in the south, because the Russians already have a bridgehead on the other side of the Dnieper, and it could be that after the winter, the Russians, after consolidating themselves, will attack further, for example, direction Odessa, or even worse, in the center of the country. The current status of the different oblasts looks like this. So Mykolaiv is about 98% still in Ukrainian hands. Kherson Oblast is to 94% in Russian hands. Zaporozhye, 75%. Kharkiv Oblast, 67% in Ukrainian hands. Luhansk is, and I'm using the Russian term, liberated by the Russians to 100%. Donetsk Oblast is occupied by about 54%. So it looks like that the Russians will try in the next weeks and months to come also to liberate the next Oblast, Donetsk. So that means the fight will still go on in the area of the Donbass till the south. So the question is, for the next weeks and months to come, where will be the main battles along the front line? Very likely in Donbass, but it is also important to know that Kherson is the place to look at. What I also would like to stress in the end, and still being in summer, is that the problem is that Ukraine has to survive the winter time. When we look at the terrain, which is already occupied by the Russians, then we know that this 20 to 24% pretty much is 80% of the added value of the Ukrainian side. If the Russians will manage to occupy Odessa too, then this number is even higher, up to 90 or 95%. The same when it comes to the grain production, especially the winter wheat. Also here you can see that it is located mainly in the south and in the east. 45% of the gross domestic product of the Ukraine was generated by exporting of grain. That concludes our brief for today. As you all know, the production of our YouTube videos and our reports are as unbiased as possible, as neutral as possible. Why is this important? Because only a neutral view about the situation, especially on the battlefield, can give you a clear impression what's going on in the field. Today, in the end, I would like to make a short difference. Last year, I had the honor to act as Austrian contingent commander in the international mission KFOR of NATO. In my international function as commander Joint Logistics Support Group, I also had command over a platoon of Ukrainian soldiers. In this platoon of Ukrainian soldiers, there were 3 officers. One of them was Captain Kirillio Hubanov, 26-year-old. He was killed in Severodonetsk in the battle for Donbass on the 10th of June 22. And today I would like to make a difference, because in this case, friendship beats neutrality. And I would like to show his picture to honor him and to make sure that he's not forgotten. Thank you for listening.
And that was Colonel Markus Reisner. He is a professor at the Austrian Military Academy. And you're listening to an update on the war in Ukraine. My name is Jim Dingeman. We're talking about the events in the fighting in the Ukraine in a holistic sense, politically, economically, militarily, and we're talking about the events that have occurred in the past week. As we last met, which was around the 4th of July weekend. And one of the changes is that there are negotiations going on between the United Nations, Ukraine, Russia, and Turkey to figure out a way to export the excess of Ukrainian wheat that is particularly been bottled up since the war began and is affecting food prices around the world, and especially access to food in different parts of the world that are even more dependent on those exports than in, for example, the United States. But we're seeing food prices rise in the United States. Again, the war in Ukraine is one factor contributing to that. I'm sure there are many, many other factors when you talk about inflation in the United States, but it is indeed a factor in the cost of food in other parts of the world, such as the Middle East, where the food that's exported from the Ukraine and Russia is a considerable high percentage of the food imports to those countries involved. And it's essentially, as we see in the discussion by the United Nations, affecting the possibility of increasing famine and starvation in other parts of the world, particularly the Horn of Africa right now. The second development that's quite important to emphasize, it is now that we are seeing the introduction of the HIMARS missile system and the MLRS system. There is now the transfer to the Ukraine of the long-range capability of missile systems, ATACMS, which can essentially reach out to 300 kilometers. Another change is that when we've been talking in these groups, and this is the first time people will be exposed to this discussion and dialogue, we've been talking about how prior to the past few weeks, the supply of weapons, particularly the howitzers and artillery pieces to Ukraine, lacked the digital GPS aiming kits. That's changed. In recent weeks and recent days, the M77 howitzers have been spotted with those kits. So in other words, the Ukrainians now can also begin to use precision-guided artillery rounds, which they're using in action against the Russian forces. And finally, there is a meeting that occurred today in Moscow where Putin called the parliament to an extraordinary meeting because they were talking about the question of how to mobilize and fight against this situation in Ukraine, because frankly, While we know that if you look at the pro-Russian accounts, the Russians are emphasizing the problems that the Ukrainians are having, and we're seeing examples of combat refusals on the Ukrainian side, certainly before the latest fighting in the Donbass. We're seeing the same thing happen in the Russian side. In fact, the Russians have ordered essentially the mobilization in each district of Russia of essentially battalions of troops that one can compare to what happened in 1944 when Hitler organized the Volkssturm. And these are kind of measures that are just inadequate and are being criticized by the right-wing media in Russia all the time. Now, I wanted to just show people a chart that details the artillery situation. Much has been talked about the balance of power in the war and the artillery differences between the two sides. The Russian open sources, and again, you have to take this all with a grain of salt. Uh, they're estimating the artillery imbalance in the Donbass fighting was on the range of about 1,400 artillery pieces that the Russians had to about 250 artillery pieces that the Ukrainians had. In other words, almost a 4-to-1, 4 to 5 to 1 superiority on the part of the Russians in terms of artillery pieces. But I wanted to now, stop my little monologue here and, open it up. Everybody can start to comment on this. The point is, here is a pretty interesting graph showing the differences in artillery between the Russians and the Ukrainians. You'll see here, this is the Russians on the right here in terms of their lesser ranged artillery pieces as opposed to the Ukrainians on the left. And you can see that you're talking about in the range of 100 and 122 millimeter weapons, we're talking about 200 versus 750. And one of the points made in the blogs is that the D-30 artillery weapon, artillery field piece, was one that the Russians then gave to the separatists. They retired it from their active duty units, and instead they were equipped with 152 millimeter SP guns over here. And you'll see the difference is 550. And look at the reserves that the Russians have: 6,600 versus 750 in the field, 550 self-propelled guns versus about 1,000 or 1,600 in reserve. And these are the numbers on the left-hand side of the differences in the Ukrainian inventory. And the 152 millimeter howitzers that both sides have, here you have a number of 400 that the Russians have, the Ukrainians have of different kinds of artillery pieces, as opposed to 250 with 1,600 in reserve in the Russian side. Both sides have found that they've been running out of 152 millimeter rounds, which is the heavier artillery piece in both sides, and this has led to actually the Russians clandestinely preventing the Ukrainians from buying artillery rounds from around the world, as they also have been forced to increase production of their own. And in there you'll see in here the difference with heavier self-propelled weapons. And here we see the Caesar. This is a French self-propelled gun. The Panzer 2000. This is a German-built weapon that was supplied by Holland to the Ukrainians, and various weapon systems, including the Angel, which is a artillery system that is Swedish made, that is now coming into the inventory. And these all have the ability to fire precision guided artillery. This is the balance of power, particularly here, 1,300 versus 2,400 in reserve. So you have a tremendous imbalance here with the amount of pure guns they have. And that's manifested in these estimates that they have 1,400 weapons in one sector, as opposed to 250 weapons in one sector. That's the fighting we've been seeing for the past couple of weeks. But here's the fighting in the MLRS situation, which is definitely changing everything. There is, as you can see, 200 different kinds of MLRS systems, including those that they inherited from the Russian army. There's about 170 of them. But the thing to concentrate on is these new weapons coming in, the MLRS and the HIMARS from the United States, which they've been using to attack ammunition dumps in Russia, and with great success from exactly hitting them. And the new weapons coming in, the MLRSs, are now coming in with the range systems. And our group here has been debating this, but let me open it up here. I just wanted to show this map, this graph to everybody, and then we'll go into other questions. So let's just bring everybody in and get their impressions as to what they think has been going on. Who wants to jump in first? Frank, yeah, go on, Frank.
Okay. Well, was particularly interesting 3 days ago, but as I've made clear, my contention is that the Russians did not exploit the collapse around Lysychansk, which was not that bad from the Ukrainian point of view. After all, they only captured 34, so they deliberately made sure that they collapsed the bag, as it were, and retreated. But there was an element of panic, it seems, and that's pushing it maybe. But under those circumstances, the Russian general staff would have or should have exploited that more than they have. Instead, there is a pause. Now, others will say that's not true. There are artillery exchanges, especially around Seversk and Bakhmut. But if judging from the satellite imagery of fires, there has been a decrease in artillery strikes. So there is a pause, and that's what Putin said. There is a operational pause. I think that has been a mistake, and essentially why they haven't pushed more there would have required them taking force from the Izium area and possibly from the Potsdana area to reinforce the breakthrough around Lysychansk. And this is all a hypothetical, of course. So what I'm essentially saying is that they've stuck with the original plan, which is to attempt to attack Sloviansk and Kramatorsk in these kind of pincer sort of Russian doll kind of maneuvers. Now, they started with Lysychansk, and then they're going to take Seversk and Bakhmut. Now, Seversk is only a small place. It's only about 11,000 people. It's not, they're going to make a big deal of it. It's not really a big deal. The question is, what is next? If there is an operational pause, what can we expect? Well, we can expect the Russians to start moving their ammo dumps in a certain way. Because of the MLRS and the effectiveness of it, out to 50 miles or 80 kilometers, they can't put their ammo dumps in convenient one place fits all, next to the railway hubs or close to the railway hubs. So they're going to have to disperse it, which makes it extremely difficult because their road capabilities, their truck capabilities aren't that good. And, then you've got a time crunch as far as the next big deployment, the big attack is concerned. So the effectiveness of HIMARS is the issue at the moment. And as you pointed out, if the M77s are getting these PICs or these GPS enabling systems, then apparently, as I read in the New York Times, the Excalibur weapon round, which is extremely precise out to 40 kilometers, will also make those 120, well, actually all the 155s, I think, are capable of firing the Excalibur. So that includes the Crabs from Poland, the howitzers, plus the M77s. It's only 1,000 rounds, but, there's a math thing here. When you fire 20,000 rounds, and on the Russian side, of 152s, if they're normal dumb rounds, HE rounds, they're probably around about $500 each. And that's it, probably even less, but we'll say $500 each. So you're firing $10 million downrange. Now, you fire, the equivalent would be about 100 MLRS rockets, which is, you say, well, obviously the difference must be well on the side of the 20,000. Well, no, because 100 MLRS rockets, provided you have the intel, provided you have the, the recon that goes with that, the target acquisition and all that, if you've got that, then you have a game changer. And that's seemingly what is happening, because ammo dumps are going up, command centers are going up, generals are going up. And that's not just in the Donbass, but particularly around Kherson. So the effectiveness of these precision munitions, it's 21st century stuff against the Soviet 20th century stuff. And I think it's starting to impact. However, the Russian army is not just a 20th century army. It has many other assets too. And that's also, to be fair, clear. They have an EW asset, electronic warfare set of, integrated into their forces, especially on the Donbass. They have what's called Shipkin arrows, which are jammers of all these drones. So that's why the TB2s and probably our Switchblades aren't very effective. They haven't been effective. In fact, they've been using TB2s as almost suicide drones. And, once you start to impact on the ability to do recon, to do precise targeting, then obviously your precision munitions go down. Now the Russians have also got precision munitions, but because they've lacked their recon ability, because now they're asking the Iranians for drones, they've actually it's been reported that they've fired their equivalent of Copperhead, which is a very precise munition, from a 152, because they, as a normal round, which is an expensive waste. So it's like us firing Excalibur, each one of those costing something like 150,000, as if it's a dumb bomb, which would be really stupid. So the whole integration of EW plus the air defense assets. One of our, Darryl asks, why is the Russian Air Force not so effective? Well, we're not sure how effective it is, but they've lost some expensive aircraft. Now imagine they've lost 10 Su-34s, for instance. Well, that's $360 million right there. Now, it makes sense to fire 20,000 rounds at $500, but it doesn't make sense to go out there and risk an Su-34, because you just lost, $36 million, that doesn't make sense in some ways. But on the other hand, you're reaching a point where if the Russians allow the Ukrainians to dominate with precision munitions, you've got to risk it. You've got to risk something to take out these HIMARS, or these MLRSs, or these M77s with their Excalibur rounds. So there's a delicate balance there. And then there's a problem around Kherson for the Russians. They aren't strong there. And if there is, as is being touted, Zelensky's saying, we've got to take this back. If there's success there, and I think they've got to do it, the Ukrainians got to do it while the ground's hard, while it's summer, and it's got to be within the next couple of weeks, because the Russians do have the capacity to get in accordance with their doctrine. In other words, they're not that smart because they haven't got the smarts on the ground. They've got a lot of conscripts and third-rate soldiers in many ways. But, you know, with a mafia kind of leadership, you can force them into actions that others perhaps wouldn't do. The Ukrainians, conversely, are very smart. You know, you've got a lot of smart software engineers and all these kind of that people, but they haven't got the what they lack is the infantry and the tank guys to do the breakthrough stuff. So there's a contrast. Now, the thing is that the Russians nevertheless have doctrine and they have, you know, by the book, ways of using these sophisticated elements like, you know, EW and air defense. So the question is, how long does it take for the Russians to get their act together? See, the difference is in kill chain time. The kill chain is the time it takes to identify a target and to put something on it. And at the moment, it looks like it's going very much in favor of the Ukraine side. Whereas the Russians have demonstrated a capability with their Iskanders, their cruise missiles, and if everything's right, if everything, you know, is okay, but generally no. And so these are factors, and I think what we got to look at is in the next couple of weeks. It's in the next couple of weeks that it's going to determine whether or not the Ukrainians can actually conduct a major offensive in the Kherson area. If they can't do it, you give them too much time for the Russians to get their act together. So that's what's at stake. And of course, all the other issues are, you know, as far as what Germany's about to do is also
right. Well, that's a whole different thing. And this I'm showing right now on the screen. This is the type of weapons, the smart weapons, if you will, that the HIMARS and the MLRSs employ. And these are, I don't know the actual mixture of rounds they're getting, but they are getting rounds and missiles that they can launch that can reach out to a couple hundred kilometers. Right, anyway.
One last thing about if you're right about the ATACMS, if the ATACMS is there, well, that, you know, the Kerch bridge is now vulnerable, will be vulnerable, as is Sevastopol. So all those corvettes the Russians have got there, they're all vulnerable. I mean, really vulnerable, and that's an instant game changer. You know, you can take out the Black Sea Fleet pretty much. That would be. I'm surprised the ATACMS were actually approved. If you're correct.
Well, again, I'm just regurgitating news reportage, which could be inaccurate, but I just was regurgitating that from the press in the past couple of days. Does anyone else want to jump in with their comments or thoughts? And by the way, here is this is a picture of what that range will give the. Let me just blow it up here. This is a picture of the range that they now have with the this increase of the ATACMS, and what he just said. Of course, they can hit the bridge over the Kerch, the Straits down there. Go on, Ted, and then they can hit Sevastopol. Go on, Ted.
Yeah, no, I don't have a great deal to contribute here, but I think Frank just touched on this point and where we are now. The impunity of the Russians to strike with cruise missiles, with aircraft, and even in that piece we saw from the Austrian colonel talking about the ability to fly major missions, a large number of planes into Ukrainian airspace and taking out targets at night. All that impunity, which is basically there because there's no way to respond to the within the Ukrainian territory, and they can't go over the border or they aren't willing to go across the border into Belarus, and they're not willing to go across the border near Kharkiv on the other side of the Russian border, and they're not being able to attack targets outside of the area that the Russians have occupied. Of course, this area, that's technically speaking, is Ukrainian territory from the point of view of the Ukrainian government. So the Crimea, and you mentioned Frank mentioned Sevastopol there. Those targets are the Russian, they can make a strong argument, the Ukrainians can make a strong argument that that's their stuff, and they can attack that without violating some magic rule that you can't attack Russia in a war which is initiated by Russia. But it's always been one of the issues that I've been concerned about, is the ability of the Russians to create an environment where NATO is afraid to engage, doesn't want to go to a nuclear war, doesn't want to invoke all the operational requirements of a war with Russia. So it's made it clear that the Russian universe, Russia itself is off limits. But that's left the Ukrainians' airspace completely open. And as the Ukrainians, of course, are claiming this is a Russian terrorist attack on cities in like the one today or yesterday, when you take a city, they claim to be attacking some kind of grouping of high-tech experts, and basically you blow up another shopping center and a school and a theater and kill 31 people, and from missiles launched from submarines in the Black Sea. You're really putting, and the Sea of Azov, I'm not sure where that one came from. You're creating a situation where you've got neutrality on one side and complete vulnerability on the other, and that has to change. So we've been looking at this in the last few weeks, maybe a couple of months. I know that Frank's been on top of this issue for quite some time, and so Aaron, who's not here tonight, but Aaron, Ray, and others have been looking at this particular talk. That the capability of the Ukrainians, if they could get large enough numbers from the West of high skill, longer range weapons and high technical skills to apply those weapons, and avoiding, as Frank also mentioned, as the Austrian colonel also mentioned, the danger is that the Russians do show, and I was demonstrating more increasingly, at least the American media, the Western media, British and included, are beginning to recognize that the Russians actually do have some pretty good skills in counter drone warfare and jamming techniques and abilities to prevent the Ukrainians from using materials that they thought that at the very beginning of the war were clearly quite effective in attacking Russian formations. If all that material is no longer if that material is somewhat more balanced, of course, the less balanced, the better for the Ukrainian side. The Ukrainians need to create strategic advantages. So I'm recommending, and I'm thinking going with Frank maybe doing the same thing, that they strike some very vulnerable targets that the Russians have and make the Russians rethink their tactics inside Ukraine. More likely, though I think that would be a good tactic, more likely the Russians would simply step up using whatever they have left of their precision missiles and cruise missiles, and these gigantic submarine launched missiles, which are blasting the way the center of Ukrainian cities, not necessarily with any military effect, but certainly with effect on public opinion, making the Russians look even more violent and lacking in credibility as peacekeepers or someone who can be negotiated with. So yeah. That's just that point is where I'll stop right now. But I really think there's no way to boost the air force of the Ukrainians without direct intervention by the NATO forces. So the anti-aircraft capabilities, if the ability to shoot down with Ukrainian missiles could be increased with anti-air, anti-missile defenses that they could be shipped in, that would help a great deal. But it's still a very big imbalance beyond in the air. Okay, that's all.
Yeah, well, the air, it's pretty clear that their amount of sorties a day is pretty small, given the fact, and when you watch the video of the Ukrainian Air Force in action, they're really close to the deck. They're going very close to avoid man pads when they launch their strikes. I saw a video just a few days ago. It's basically, I think it was about 4 to 6 aircraft launching a strike against a target with missiles. And they're all flying close to the deck, the same way with the helicopters, or both sides, of course.
We've seen both sides seem to be doing that.
Dramatic pictures. I just want to show this. This is the Sevastopol and the Crimean Bridge that we just were talking about. There's Snake Island, which has been reoccupied. And Snake Island, of course, is that was where the famous shot of the "fuck you" postal stamp, the soldier giving the finger to the Russian ship, I think the Moskova, in fact. But anyway, and you can see in a larger picture here the importance of Snake Island in a sense of clearing the Black Sea for some sort of program that would, I guess, be supervised by NATO and, excuse me, with the United Nations and Turkey to get grain ships out. And the reason I show this is that, of course, these areas are mined. They have different kind of mines already in place there, contact mines and mines that go down below to the surface of the sea, and to demine them would require a joint flotilla of all sorts of mine-sweeping assets from, all, frankly, the NATO powers to go in there and clean up whatever mines exist to allow a unimpeded export of grain. The other options, of course, is to ship the grain by land, which is prohibitively expensive. That will definitely raise the price of food around the world. They're even talking about how if you're trying to buy hummus in the Middle East, the prices of that are increasing because of this. And I'll get to you in a second, Gary. And here's a map of the strikes of the HIMARS that are hitting all these areas in the rear. Melitopol was hit. I believe a division headquarters of the 106th Airborne Division of the Russian Army was destroyed either today or yesterday by HIMARS fire. And here again, closer to the border, are targets that the both sides are hitting that are closer. This is from, what day is this? This is from today, actually, from July 15th. Go on, Gary. Gary, your comment?
Yeah, so first of all, I mean, obviously, the events over the last couple of weeks have been not good from the standpoint of people such as myself who support Ukraine. But I do think we need to keep in sight the larger context. I remind everyone what I said the very first week back in February. Even if Russia defeats Ukraine completely and occupies the entire country and is able to put down any subsequent, rebellion that might develop, it's still a negative loss for them. Now, of course, if you're Ukrainian, that's kind of cold comfort, except possibly in the long run, because you have a lot at stake in the meantime. And obviously developments have looked negative, but again, we got to compare that to what what a lot of people were thinking at the very beginning, that the whole thing would be over in a matter of days or weeks. And here we are talking about relatively small incremental advances on the part of the Russians, as if there's major victories. I would say another, in a strange way, sort of negative piece of news that I read recently is this talk of this major counteroffensive, and even evidently from official sources, saying that there's going to be 1 million troops, Ukrainian troops, counter-attacking in the Kherson region. And of course, that just doesn't seem realistic, and it almost sounds like whistling past the graveyard, or just propaganda. I don't really put a huge stock in these kind of Wunderwaffe, like the precision guided weapons. Obviously, they're a great capability to have, but at the end of the day, you're either going to have a victory by long term through just attrition and exhaustion, or you're going to have to recapture a lot of territory, either in a slow, methodical way, as the Russians have been showing recently, or hopefully in a more spectacular fashion. But it just seems to me that there really isn't, Frank talks about the 2-week time frame. Again, I don't see that as really realistic. We are suffering from a dearth of real knowledge of what's going on. You're hoping in the background that they are organizing and training a mass of a fairly large number of larger size units, brigades or perhaps even divisions. That's sort of a term we don't really hear in this war, but perhaps the brigade is the largest tactical unit we're really going to deal with. But that's really to be seen. And I don't really see that sort of thing, that just from the amount of time it's likely to take. Plus, I think the very regrettable fact that the West, especially the United States, the Biden administration, has been slow walking their buildup of capability, especially in terms of weapons, into Ukraine. I just feel like that has been very detrimental, and it's very regrettable. Perhaps there's something going on behind the scenes we don't know about, and they're trying to keep it low profile. I mean, I would like to believe that. I don't really believe that, but I guess that's always, we'll never know until afterwards. And the last thing I'd like to say is I don't really think this recent initiative by the seeming flexibility by the Russians with regard to the grain shipments, to me, this is classic Russian tactic, negotiating tactic. Pretend like you're making progress, and then in the end, to sort of cast yourself in the best light, and then scupper the whole thing once you've taken your whatever short-term advantages you've gotten out of that.
All right. I just wanted to share other news today. As you can see, Poland is going to sell T-72 tanks to the Ukraine, and they're going to buy, I guess, M1As, A1s. They're going to buy and they're going to buy K2 tanks. I believe those are Korean tanks, to make up their loss of equipment. There's a very interesting vignette that's been taken off the Twitter. It's by a Ukrainian armor officer, and I'll show that in a few minutes. It's a very interesting vignette about what's going on. I'm just going to now just go through quickly some of the news of today. Now, there is a blogger, basically his name is Dmitriev, and he uses the term Alexandra Kromov, and essentially he's talking about how this, if you'll notice in the bottom here, I'll just blow it up a little bit so you can see it better. He's talking about how this situation here that we're seeing right now is a third tipping point. And here you get into this, it's amazing. These are blogs that are basically from the right, the conservative right in Russia. And you can see that what he's saying, he says the war's gone through three tipping points. The first tipping point was when they didn't succeed in overwhelming them by the third day of February of this year, when their whole coup de main operation failed. Then the second phase is the fighting we've seen going on right now in the Donbass, when they shifted troops to basically attack in the Donbass. But he feels that has failed. In fact, you see there's a common theme in these conservative Russian blogs that include Igor Gurkin. Igor Gurkin, as I say, was an FSB officer in the FSB, of course, is a successor to the KGB. So he was a covert operations paramilitary type guy. And he has been rather candid with his sources in condemning Putin. In fact, he says in one of his blogs a few weeks ago, he compared what was going on now to the Russo-Japanese War in terms of its possible political impact domestically in Russia, which I found extraordinary. But again, you have to keep his political perspective in mind. He's a monarchist. But now he's talking about, in this particular blog here, that now we have to mobilize and go to wartime economy mode. And who knows what happened today in the parliament of Russia, whether in fact that is the case. Now, this is again from today. This is about the fighting around Kramatorsk. And as you can see, this is from this Navy SEAL, Mr. Pfefferer, and this is Frank Pfefferer, and he's talking about the line of defense that has been formed around Seversk, that they're fighting on right now, when the bulk of the troops that were threatened with encirclement would treat it out of that. You saw the Colonel Reisner showed infantrymen coming along the road there. Most of those troops were able to be withdrawn and not encircled. And here you have the terrain around Slavyansk. They're now fighting in the suburbs of Slavyansk. That's of today. This is from today, talking about the fighting. And of course, there's shelling going on all along the line here to affect the tactical situation. Now, the reason I bring up Iran is that what's interesting is this is, of course, a missive from the National Counterterrorism Center today, talking about there's the possibility that's been since Commander Soleimani was killed in 2020. You remember the head of the Quds forces was assassinated by the United States in Baghdad with a very precise attack on him. In fact, I believe there were Delta Force guys on the ground helping to send in the rounds that killed him. But in any event, this is interesting because you've seen now equipment that's been captured by from the Houthis winding up in the Ukraine. 120 millimeter mortars are now showing up in the Ukraine. And there was the death of one of these Brits that was captured. The gentleman on the left died today, and this is now becoming an international incident, alongside, of course, the basketball player in Moscow, the WNBA basketball player Bryant, who's been in prison for a while. And Brittany Griner, right? And here's this report today that the Security Council of Russia met today, this afternoon, after an extraordinary session of the Russian Parliament. So we're going to see what happens with them tomorrow. Now, I just wanted to bring in domestic politics in the United States. We know, of course, that inflation is taking a bite out of Biden's approval rating. This is an interesting poll taken today and published in the Washington Post about the effect. Again, Ukraine is not a factor affecting anything in any great significance in all these polls. Inflation is number one. What's interesting about this is that you're starting to see the effect of the January 6th hearings on Republican voters. That I was not expecting to see dramatically deployed here. They're also talking about the effect of Roe v. Wade, which has impacted public opinion, whether it's going to make a change in the midterm elections or not. But Roe v. Wade has indeed started to impact the possible voting of Republicans. And then you still have those that are in favor of President Trump being reelected. Still 80% of them feel he was cheated out of election in 2020. And again, here's this inflation numbers. Many Americans inflation important. 80% of Americans find that extremely important. Again, we're seeing that reflected all over the world, where inflation is even worse. Look at what's just happened in Sri Lanka, where the actual White House equivalent of the president of the country was overrun by protesters just a few days ago. Again, there's differences in the class basis of where people are voting, but here is the question of who's going to deal with the economy better. The Republicans, of course, feel they are going to be able to handle it. But there's also a crossover vote from Democrats who want to support the Republicans in that issue. They think the Republicans will handle the inflation issue better. In fact, you'll have voters say, look, I don't care what's going on. When Trump was president, I didn't have this terrible inflation to deal with. So, again, a factor in the election to consider. And this is, again, a poll that was taken today. This is the New York Times. About the differences in political opinion. And finally, the war in Ukraine. Now, what's occurring, of course, is war fatigue on the part of different countries. And we're getting into the politics of France, Germany, and Italy about supplying weapons and economic wherewithal to the effort against Russia. And this is in stark contrast to the United States, and the United Kingdom in particular. And again, we don't know what the blowout from Boris Johnson resigning is going to be. But you're talking about an incredible, basically Macron talking about and actually annoying the United States when he made his comments about we have to oppose Putin, but we don't want to humiliate Putin. And you have this division in the strategy between the West and these other countries about what are we out? What's the ultimate aim here? And you've had pretty maximalist kind of comments by American members of the Biden administration. We want to defeat them. We want to humiliate them, etc. We want to teach them a lesson. So you have these kind of differences in perhaps strategy, and then of course you have the problems of the recession in Europe, which we've talked about again and again. And here, this is just to show you some of the fighting today. That I believe this is a shopping center that was struck by the Russians again. And again, I don't know what the nature of their targeting is. Are they deliberately targeting civilians? What are they doing? What is there military targets that they're near? I think we had a big debate about that a few weeks ago with us talking about that Krimichong raid that occurred, and then the question of that the shopping center was hit and the relationship of it to quote military targets end quote. And here's this announcement of ATACMS today going into the theater of operations. Let me just conclude this part of today with let's see. We went through this. That's it for today in terms of the discussion of the latest news. This is fighting on the Kherson pocket axis. Now, this is something where people are constantly talking about: are the Ukrainians mounting a counteroffensive aimed at Kherson? And the whole question of what they have in reserve: should they attack? Should they not attack? In fact, you see the Russian bloggers say the same thing. But in any event, let's just see. Go on. Darryl, you go first. Go on, Darryl.
Before you finish the news, and I apologize because I was unable to source this out, but two things that you might want to include. One, there was a report on a very high amount given to, I believe it was people willing to leave prison to go directly to the front, and it was something like double the salary of the average individual. Two, there was a report because of the heat wave going through Europe at this particular point in time. There was a report on the wheat harvest in the various countries, and how that was how the weather was affecting the grain. That might have actually been, well, I know there was something on, I should say, I believe I know there was something on the PBS NewsHour on that, and how that's going to roll into this other wheat challenge. The interesting thing that I haven't heard anything about is what is American, Canadian, and Australian wheat production this year? And are they compensating in any fashion?
Good question.
The other piece is with regard to inflation and how it's being explained, and I understand how it's being experienced. But for instance, Brandon sent out a piece that you could have all the oil in the world released, all the raw oil in the world released into this country right now, and there's no refining capacity. Refineries are going 24/7, and they're putting out as much as they're able to produce. And therefore, if you don't have the product, you're going to have a problem if you have a monopoly capitalist class that wants to make back its money from 2020. So I think that the American population, what's required is a re-education of economy. I listened to David, the gentleman from the New York Times, it's on the PBS NewsHour, talk about this. Excuse me?
Yeah, go on, sorry.
Yeah, I'm having, those moments, right? I listened to him explain this pain, the kind of pain that you're talking about, say, well, when Trump was president, look at the dynamics. Oh, he was lauding. Here it is. You got two problems. The other thing is how West Virginia senator. God,
Manchin.
Yes, he bailed out on the climate deal and the rest of what's left of the Build Back Better. So what I'm understanding is that from overseas, Biden said, okay, well, forget the climate, just let us get something. So whatever Manchin decides, it appears, is what we're going to get. However, what David, last name to be filled in later, was applauding Manchin for was calling that, if Build Back Better comes into effect, this is going to be great inflation. And okay, so now you have inflation. So therefore, Manchin should be lauded for making this prediction. A, has nothing to do with it. B, if the Democrats had done Build Back Better, people would be working, have money, and would have a backup, which now the Republicans are denying them, both with regard to, quote unquote, the pandemic, but to anything. So to evaluate the inflation that the American public is experiencing now with, quote unquote, traditional inflation, and then if you throw on, if the Fed throws up what they're threatening to be like a 1% increase in the interest rate, that's great if you're saving money. However, if you've got half the population trying to figure out how they can stay in their apartments with 50% increases in New York apartments that aren't rent controlled, you're looking at a really nasty situation here that I think people are failing to evaluate. Now, what does it have to do with the war? Well, what do you think is going to happen if the Republicans get back into power? Are the Ukrainians going to be supported at all? And the last piece that I'll throw in is, I'm still struggling with that war piece, so I need you to post where I can see the air battles. However, even more important than that, back in the 60s, there was a range that you could do with your AWACS, the airborne, not warning center, but weapons control center, right?
Warning,
yeah. I'm having a challenge here. You got a telescope out in space that can look 500 miles into the past, right? But you don't know where. I'm not talking about the Ukrainians and the drones. I'm talking about NATO weaponry capability right now. How does this work out if the Russians walk over the Ukrainians?
Good question. Let me just show you this. This is a comment by Igor Gherkin. This is essentially, this is just to give you some of the arguments going on in Russia right now. That here is Gherkin, and his attitudes, I might say, or I've seen in other commentary coming out of Russian media, that the situation is the U.S. is losing its world hegemony, China plays a role, and for the United States, it's essential to have a large war with China. The U.S. believes it can overthrow Russia and set up a pro-Western puppet regime in Russia to use against the war against China. Interesting. And he talked here about the fighting going on. The liberation of Donbass will not affect the outcome of the war. The south of the Ukraine will be the main battlefield due to availability of aviation reconnaissance, and the threats are to be taken seriously. And then they're talking about these 300 to 500 kilometer long range missiles that are coming in to the limited amount of MLRSs, and they're complaining about how the replacements coming onto the line that the Russians are sending are equipped with Mosin Nagant rifles. Now, that's a rifle going back to the early 20th century. And Degtyaryov, these are, again, machine guns going back to the early part of the 20th century that were used in the Second World War. And the Ukrainians, of course, are talking about creating a 1 million man army that will be equipped and sustained by the West. So, and here again, this is, again, they're arguing to a Russian audience the United States wants to try and trigger Russia to attack NATO and Poland, but more importantly, in Kaliningrad in the Suwalki Gap. If you know, recently there was a upgrade in the sanctions regime that was restricting certain kind of shipments to Kaliningrad going through Lithuania, and the Russians got angry at that and threatened the Lithuanians. And then here you have a possibility of an unexpected nuclear strike to shut down nuclear capabilities of the Russian Federation. So talking about a first strike. Again, this is again, I'm keeping this in mind with the proviso. This is what's being discussed in a highly listened to blog in Russia that is in contrast to some of the other media sources. And here, of course, they're talking about, this is again just a day or two ago, they're talking about the attacks on the ammo dumps, that they've had an effect. Why is Ukraine destroying the Russian air defense? Because this is again, again they're talking about how the MLRSs are probably being used to take out the Russian, probably S-300s, their surface air missile units, and that of course is something that would make it easier for the Ukrainian Air Force to operate. And then you have other comments here. But before I bring you in, Frank, let me bring Jim in. Go on, Jim.
I wanted to give a little broader perspective that as you were doing here. First, I want to just say, seeing those soldiers dying, really, that's tough. Brought tears to my eyes seeing that, and it reminded me of Major Major General Smedley Butler's words: "War's a racket, and it always has been, and a few profit and many pay, and we saw people paying there." But there is a way to stop it, he said. It can be smashed effectively only by taking the profit out of it. I think that's what we have to think about. Who's profiting from this war? And it's not just the Russians, as most of Western media discusses it, or the way they frame it. I'm against this war. I'm against the invasion. But I was also against the Ukraine escalation of attacks in the Donbass in the month before February 24th. So there's a lot going on there. And if you don't see this propaganda that's going on here and how it's being portrayed, there was a good line today by
We lost you a second, Jim. Did your computer freeze?
maybe. I didn't get a message.
Okay. Yeah, go on. We can hear you now.
And sometimes it'll do that. Although I have, it did it just now again. You still got me?
Yeah, we got you, man. Go on.
Okay. So I saw a quote by Chomsky today that I took today. It's quite interesting that in American discourse, it's almost obligatory to refer to the invasion as the unprovoked invasion of Ukraine. And if you look it up in Google, you will find hundreds of thousands of hits. Of course, it was provoked. Otherwise, they wouldn't be referring to it all the time as the unprovoked invasion, And Caitlin Johnson said something interesting. She said, people don't go adding the same gratuitous adjectives and modifiers to something over and over again unless they're trying to manipulate how it's perceived. And so if your neighbor always refers to his wife as my wife, who I definitely never beat, you immediately become suspicious, because that's not how normal people talk about normal things. So I think this war was provoked, but that doesn't give Russia, a free hand. If you insult somebody and then you get punched in the nose, the guy who punched you is in the wrong. So I'm not saying that. But I think you have to look at it in a global sense. And I think there's a really good movie out there, a documentary by Stone called Ukraine on Fire. And I'd recommend people to watch it, because it gives a long history of the region, but also a long history, going back for the last 20 years, and how it's been built up, and what the coup in 2014, how that plays into this. And but I still believe the best result is ending the war as fast as possible, because I think the people of Ukraine are the huge losers, and the only winners are, U.S. big oil, our arms industry, and U.S. control over NATO. Those are the big winners in this, and I think that's where you have to look at it. And I think the whole way this war is being portrayed was described pretty well by Patrick Lawrence in the last couple of days in an article called "The Imaginary War," where he talks about projected Russian motives and also the U.S. and the West not listening to what the Russians were saying before the war, and then since the war started, believing everything Ukraine would say, without any fact checking. And Matt Taibbi talks about how the level of attacks on journalists who don't toe the DC, New York Post, New York Times, and Post narratives are just, they get attacked, So we hear this narrative, was Ukraine is winning, and that was combined with kind of racist characterizations of Russians as being incompetent. And then when it didn't happen, then they started focusing on war crimes without any real independent witnesses. And then you see U.S., more recently, and especially on the war crime issue, the U.S. has no moral high ground on the issue of collateral damage, which is what the latest articles are about. We have no moral high ground in that. What we did in Iraq is just unconscionable, and not just with our bombs, but what we did with our sanctions to kill, a million people. And the latest is that, these U.S. weapons, $50 billion worth, are somehow going to magically win the war, when the amount of attrition of Ukrainian troops seems to be really high, even admitted by their generals. So I think you're already starting to see stories that distance people from supporting this war, just like we saw at some point in Iraq. And it looks like Biden's going to be the fall guy, but Biden's just the front man. He's a continuation. This is a continuation of PNEC's neocon plan to rule the world. They had, a plan to invade, 7 countries or something, after Iraq, and which kind of fell apart. But that's the most recent incarnation being Obama's Asian pivot. And that Asian pivot required isolating Russia from the EU before concentrating on China. And if you look at the big picture, that's what's really going on. So to understand this, I really think you need that global lens. Otherwise, you really miss the forest through the trees.
Well, thank you, Jim. And it's funny, one of the people we send notices to this to is someone who was Wolfowitz's aide when he was in the Pentagon. And I remember when they published that study after the collapse of the Soviet Union, which basically argued that the United States should use its single unilateral moment of power to expand its control around the world. I'll never forget that, because I remember calling this person up. He'll remain nameless since we're making this public. And I said, what the hell are you guys doing? You want to control the world? I mean, I thought you already did. And so it'd be interesting to have him on at some point talking about this, because he's also a specialist of Russia, and it'd be interesting to hear his point of view on this. I know that Zelensky just in the past couple of days did a purge of his diplomatic representatives around the European countries, and he replaced the ambassador to Germany. And one of the reasons that he replaced him was this particular ambassador was extolling Stefan Bandera. And Stefan Bandera, of course, doesn't go too well in the Western public, because he was an upfront and open collaborator with Nazi Germany. He actually initiated a pogrom in Lviv before the Germans even took Lviv in 1941 during the onset of Operation Barbarossa. So there's all these ambiguities about what's going on that remain unexplored. Go on, Frank.
Well, okay. Yeah, the cynicism of the military-industrial complex is a point that has obviously been much ballyhooed about by the left. One of the reasons why you have precision munitions is because of the annoyance that comes with ROE, rules of engagement. You know, you can't have collateral damage because the laws that we are governed by, you know, the conventions we are governed by, make it such that if you're going to target during this period while we're in the Middle East, you're going to target an individual, you can't have collateral damage such that people are killed. Now, obviously, it happens all the time. Happens in Israel too. So one of the things to get around that is precision munitions. So this has been an evolution, partly because we're trying to retain the moral high ground. Now, as far as whitewashing, and I mean this in every sense, Putin, it's not just Chomsky, it's not just Oliver Stone on the left, it's also Tucker Carlson. And one of the surprising people is Jordan Peterson, who's the sort of the guru of the right, or used to be, from my point of view anyway, who's a Canadian, detests Trudeau, but very eloquent, extremely difficult to counter in his arguments. But in a recent YouTube commentary, he essentially started out by saying he'd had a discussion with Kagan, who's very much the DC kind of guy. But he ends up by saying that essentially because of wokeism and what's happened with the binary issues, the model is Putin and his adherence to religion and what Russia's doing, and that Ukraine should, like the left is saying, should give it up. So what we've got is, the extreme right and left. This is like the horseshoe argument that was in foreign policy. You've got an argument that's backing Putin to the hilt with some seriously bogus arguments. But anyway, that puts tremendous pressure on the Ukrainian army, because they know that if the midterm goes as is predicted in the United States, that is important. And of course, in Germany, when you say that Ukraine, this war, this invasion, which is what it is, and to say that, if one side keeps saying it's a special military operation, and you keep saying, no, it's an unprovoked invasion, actually you're trying to neutralize that other argument. That doesn't mean you're actually validating the SMO argument. So I don't quite see the logic in that. But anyway, that aside, this midterm is going to be a nail biter. And as far as what impact this war has had on the world economy, you can say COVID, you can say other things, but essentially it has had a major blow to energy and the sanctions themselves, but the war itself. And yes, Russia can absolutely, over time, because there are known reserves in both the Azov and in the Donbass region of oil and natural gas. So yeah, you can actually profit from war. So you're right about that. But the thing is, Ukraine has to make some kind of serious, they must take the initiative. They must go on the offensive very quickly, because you've got elements on the extreme left and elements on the extreme right who are working against them for their own ends. To, that's how democracy works. It's like if you're going to topple whoever's in power, you've got to be in opposition. If that means you've got to be in opposition such that you're on the side of the enemy, so be it. That happened in Vietnam, I would argue. So this needs to be addressed. And unfortunately, if you look at the media, the media is going to be preoccupied with Roe versus Wade, with the 6th of January, and the only way you get it to be somehow front and center is if the Russians do, what stupidly start hitting malls and buildings where lots of people have killed. Otherwise, when you get into the nitty gritty about who's going to win on the battlefield, that gets very old fast when it comes to an audience. So that doesn't work. What they need to show is that yes, the weapons we're providing them actually make a difference. And of course, ATACMS will do that. And that seems to be a bipartisan decision over here. And that's good because there's precious little else that's bipartisan. It's so polarized, it's ridiculous. And by the way, Jordan Peterson is talking about the inevitable civil war here. And of course, that's obviously music to the ears of those who are anti-imperialist, anti-capitalist as well. So, they're working towards the same end. It's a damn shame. But, if Ukraine demonstrates success on the battlefield, of course, obviously Putin realizes that, so they may be digging in seriously. They just want to hang it out, hang tough until the midterms. And of course, all the other, we see Draghi in Italy. He's on the ropes. I don't know if he's actually resigned, but
yeah, he's being replaced.
Yeah, right. So you're looking at Macron. Macron was got through, and there was hardly anybody turned out for the vote. It was pathetic. Of course, you got the Gilets jaunes, and you got in the Netherlands. You've got they're all doing their thing with the agricultural. The farmers are against all the strict climate change coding. So there's deep-seated unrest there. And of course, Germany's on the ropes to the max because I understand their auto industry is down like 17%, something like that. And of course, they're worried about the winter. Where's the gas going to come from? And guess what? Putin realizes that too. Yeah, democracy is actually, the difference is that fortunately for Ukraine, you don't have an American army telling them what to do because that never works. Since Korea, that has never worked. So they're making their own decisions. I think that's a good thing, although they're trying to obviously marry up with NATO as much as they can. As far as AWACS, which is another question, AWACS is good for the Kherson region. You go towards the border, it's beyond its range. So, they're flying along the Romanian border. So yes, AWACS can absolutely make a positive impact on Ukraine in the Kherson area and down over the Black Sea. So that's basically it. Now, if you're going to vouch for Oliver Stone and Chomsky as well as Jordan Peterson and also Tucker Carlson, well, less power to you.
Well, anyway, obviously the Oliver Stone movie is an important movie to watch for its point of view, and all the other sources are part of the mix. But Darryl, your comments.
Okay, then do we need to revisit the denazification then? Because it's never been clear to me how many people in the upper echelon of the Zelensky government were part of the Azov crowd. And that would be very helpful to define that. If you're saying that he rooted somebody out because they made positive comments about the gentleman from World War II, Mr. Banderas, then that's good. But we need to find out the other thing that I thought that the United States was holding back on the weapons for were too unsure as to where all the weaponry and ammunition and small arms were going to go. I think Frank even mentioned that there were some problems with upper echelon folks in Lviv failing to move the equipment quickly enough to the front. With regard to AWACS, I'm still having a struggle with that. It's Ukrainian territory. The United States has the ability to fly very, very high over Ukrainian territory. And once again, if you can see a gnat from 100,000 feet in an old U-2 or something like that, I don't see the problem. There were two more things, but I'll let that go with that. I just need to someone explain to, oh, the other thing is, I think that I have a hard time believing that the Ukrainian general staff is allowed to make all the calls on their own. So if someone would help me understand what interest either NATO or United States Department of Defense would have in allowing Ukrainians free reign on the battlefield with their weapons, I'll bite.
All right. Well, first of all, the political composition of the Ukrainian government has changed since the Maidan rebellion. There was indeed a large percentage politically of people who were aligned with the far right, the neo-Nazi movement in the government after the rebellion. They have, I believe, diminished in their role before the war broke out. I think they had about 1 to 2% of the seats in the parliament of Ukraine. But again, it's a complicated political picture. We've not really had, I've listened to people talk about it who were informed about it. But for example, there was a person who contacted me from the University of Berlin who wrote a biography about Stefan Bandera. And I would like to get him on the air, but maybe he was discussing, a little reluctant to talk. But again, it's a good question to ask. The issue of NATO calling the shots, I don't know the answer to that question. I know that the Ukrainians, they're probably, even if we look at the innards of the situation in Vietnam in the early 70s, the ARVN, the GVN was, starting to get pretty independent in terms of their foreign policy. People forget that Diem was overthrown in '63 because he was talking about independently launching foreign initiatives with the North, which is one of the reasons why he was overthrown by the U.S. In August of 1963, September of 1963. The same thing happened in the period after Nixon came into power. He began to argue, Nguyen Cao Ky began to argue different kinds of presentations to develop foreign policy alliances with the North. So did Nguyen Ben too. So it's usually, in retrospect, from those kind of experiences or knowledge, it's too, sometimes you could say, oh, they're puppets of the U.S., but then they're sort of independent puppets, if you will. Now, Mike, you just came on. What do you want? You want to jump in here, Mike, with some comments?
Well, you'll have to give me a short briefing, because I just came on. Where are you?
We've been talking about the latest developments. We're going to end this. We're doing more of a show here tonight, and I'm going to end it after your comments. But, you have the last word to talk about what you want in terms of what you think is happening in the Ukraine right now.
Well, what I think is happening is that it appears to me, and I know you've probably gone over this, that the Russian offensive has stalled, if not stopped. Ukraine has supposedly been launching some stuff deeper into Russian territory, not Russian territory, Russian occupied territory. And I don't know. I don't know what's going to go on. I mean, I heard a couple of the issues you were talking about, which is as far as, whether or not how much neo-Nazi influence there is in the Ukrainian government. I'm under the impression that there is minimal, if not no, neo-Nazi influence in the Ukrainian government right now. There have been people who have made stupid remarks But when it comes to stupid remarks, nobody compares with the United States government and Congress. So I think it would be throwing stones if we were to say, oh, they've got some bad people in their parliament. When if you look at some of the right-wing fruitcakes we have in our country, there is no comparison. Anyway, as far as where made, it seems to me that as far as, I mean, the standard operating procedure as far as weaponry goes, excuse me, is that if NATO or the U.S. or Britain gives a country weapons, there are certain limitations on their use, and they basically follow those rules. If NATO has, in other words, there are certain lines that you don't cross. But other than that, I think that the Ukrainian High Command has autonomy within those limitations. If it hasn't, if something's changed, I'd sure like to know about it. And again, yeah, there is a problem because there's a lot of bad stuff happening over here with these Supreme Court rulings and Joe Manchin and everything like that, excuse me, which is going to detract, obviously, attention from Ukraine. So, and I don't know, I mean, Joe Manchin putting the kibosh on any attempt to fight climate change is, I don't think, is a result of, Russian meddling. That's a homegrown problem we have there. So I don't know. I don't know what that will do vis-a-vis, what kind of effect that will have vis-a-vis Ukraine. But right now, it seems to be for the time being, somewhat positive in terms of, Ukraine's ability to at least stop the Russians from making any more advances and hopefully pushing back. And that's it.
All right, thank you, Michael. And I'm going to end this with Jim McFadden.
Can I just jump in and make one little quick comment
about
Gary. This? And that is, it's my opinion that if you want to see a resurgence of right-wing neo-Nazi fascism in Ukraine, I think that would be the largest risk of that is if the Western powers force the Ukrainian government to accept peace terms that are, that they perceive as unfavorable. I think you would see, I mean, politics goes on in Ukraine as well. I know everyone thinks Zelensky is the be all and end all, and I'm sure he's very popular there. And I'm not saying that necessarily would threaten his rule, but I do believe that if there was peace terms forced on Ukraine, that a large percentage of Ukrainians felt were unfavorable, I do think you would see a massive resurgence of right-wing reaction there. Anyway, that's my
right. Thank you.
I'll just chime in, and we've seen that happen before. I think in Germany.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's like you've seen it in many different places. It's almost human. It's many historical precedents. So
right.
Yeah.
Right.
Thanks, Mike.
All right. Well, anyway, let me end with reading something that Jim McFadden just put in the chat. It doesn't matter who wins because either way, oligarchs will rule. Meet the new boss, same as the old boss. And the majority of Ukrainians will pay the cost of war. If the Russians pull out, Ukraine would be under the U.S. oligarch control as a debtor-client state. If the Russians stay, Ukrainians will be under Russian oligarch control. And if they call it a tie, the Ukrainians will be Ukrainian oligarch control. What is needed by Ukrainians to reduce the hurt is an immediate negotiated settlement. But the U.S. will veto that because this is the first round of the new Cold War with Russia and China to maintain U.S. hegemony. And the debate continues. You've been listening to an update on the war in Ukraine. My name is Jim Dingeman. I'm joined with our very informed group of folks talking about this conflict tonight. And we're going to repeat this in 2 days. So just stay tuned. We're going to talk about the war in Ukraine. And again, the purpose of this is we have many people with different opinions. And the purpose of this is to express those opinions, have those opinions argued, clash, etc. At the same time, trying to view the war from a holistic point of view, getting down to the tactical detail of the fighting, up to the issues raised in terms of global politics and climate change around the world, which this war has indirectly impacted on in many ways. I want to thank everybody tonight for joining us, and we look forward to hearing and listening to your comments as we progress.